Welcome back to Financial Clarity for Doctors. This is Rachelle Vanderzanden here with Corey Janoff.
Kids are off school today. I'm in a hoodie. Didn't even brush my teeth yet. So it's
Hat,
a day. We'll make through it.
hairs.
We'll get through this.
It's all good. Those random days off of school, though, look, they get you.
Yeah,
So
it's
we are still
teacher
going to do the
conferences this week.
podcast. Yeah,
Yep.
ours are next week. That's exciting. But we're going to make this podcast happen anyway, kids or no kids. And today we're going to talk a little bit about paying off your mortgage faster or not. And I think a lot of times we had clients ask us this when interest rates were really low and everyone had like a 3% mortgage or something like that. And the answer was often, why would you do that? Like your mortgage is 3%. Like there's just not a whole lot of incentive to pay that off faster, knowing you could potentially like invest money and get a lot better return than that. And that's a lot of the trade offs that we're looking at. Like, what else could you potentially do with this money? But that's just not the case anymore. Like a lot of people are now taking on mortgages that are 6.5%, 7%. So it becomes a much more nuanced conversation and something that's worth digging into a little bit. So we're going to talk about when does it potentially make sense to do this? When does it not? Some other reasons outside of just like, okay, what's better, investing or debt? Because those aren't the only conversations that we want to have here, even though that is a very important one. So, I think the biggest thing is that like your mortgage payment, your housing payment, it's probably going to be like the biggest part of your cash flow every month for as long as you have that. So, we're going to go a little bit into like, what does your mortgage look like? When does it potentially make sense to pay extra? When does it not? And all of those kinds of things.
Yep. Yeah, we'll talk about the math and spreadsheet answers and then also some of the emotional reasons as well. And just overall financial planning. Like it doesn't always fit into a spreadsheet and calculator. We don't live in a vacuum. But
Yep.
yeah, like Rachelle said, mortgage, biggest payment in your life. It'd be nice to not have that and it'd be nice to be done with it and get it out of your life. Imagine what your life would be like if you didn't have a house payment. Like you could do a lot of other things.
Yeah.
And
You would still have some housing costs. Like you'd still have to pay the homeowner's insurance and the property taxes, which is like part of your mortgage, but it would be significantly less than it is right now, which would
for
be
sure.
awesome.
And there's
Yeah.
always maintenance expenses if you're a homeowner, especially if you've
Mhm.
got a home with a paid off mortgage, means it's probably an older home that's going to require more maintenance. So unless you just bought a brand new home for all cash, but then you're probably not listening to this podcast anyways. Um, so, when does it make sense to pay down extra? When does it make sense to invest more? Let's walk through just a fun little math example to start with because we like math. We're kind of math nerds here. But typical mortgage, 30 years long. Let's say you have a $500,000 mortgage and don't worry about the dollar amount. Maybe your mortgage is a million, maybe it's 300,000, doesn't matter. Like just go with this for fun, humorous. But let's say you have a $500,000 mortgage at 6.5% interest. Over a 30-year span, your monthly payment on that mortgage will be $3,160 per month. And over the 30 years, if you just pay the minimum every single month for 360 months, 30 years, you will pay almost $640,000 in interest over the life of your loan. And for any homeowners out there, like when you originally take out a mortgage, they show you that table that's like, here's your payment, here's the lifetime interest on this loan, and it makes you want to vomit. You're like, oh, the interest is more than the actual house. Like,
Yes. Yeah.
and
That piece of paper that you get is pretty astounding at the beginning. And they're like, if you do this, you only pay this amount of interest. And if you're just looking at that interest number, then it's like knee jerk reaction. Let's pay this off faster. But obviously, there's going to be more to it than that.
yeah, it's a big scare tactic because it's like, all right, if I just paid 500,000 in cash, I would have zero interest. But that's
Mhm.
$500,000 you can't do something else with. What else could you do in your life with that $500,000? I mean, the reason you're taking out a loan in the first place is you don't have the $500,000 lying around to pay cash for the house. You want to live in a house that you own, but you also have other priorities in life that cost money that you want to contribute to. So a mortgage, while it can be a little daunting to look at that interest figure, it's a great tool to help you accomplish this goal while still accomplishing other goals that you have in life, without having to put off one or the other. So debt is a great tool if used correctly. It can be abused, absolutely. But if it's used correctly and judiciously, it can definitely help you achieve your financial objectives faster. But back to the numbers: 3160 a month, 640,000 in interest over 30 years. Well, what if we just paid a little extra? What if we paid that loan off in 20 years instead of 30 years? We'd have to pay more. We'd have to pay $3,728 per month. So an extra 567 and change per month. But we'd have the loan paid off 10 years faster, and we would only pay about 400,000 in interest over the 20 years. So we're saving 240,000 in interest for just an extra, not even $7,000 a year. That seems like a winning formula to me, right, Rachelle?
Absolutely. And I think that that's the thing that you look at and you have that knee jerk reaction. You're like, why would I not do that? And maybe it does make sense. So we're going to go through like, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But also, it's like, you got to look at what else you could potentially do with that money and take that into consideration as well. The one other thing to keep in mind is that mortgage interest can potentially be tax deductible. So, sure, like we are paying interest on our mortgage, but if you itemize your taxes and if your itemized deductions are more than your standard deduction on your taxes, like you basically have more costs that you can write off than like the standard deduction, then you end up not paying taxes on that amount, like whatever the interest is plus whatever your other itemized deductions are. So it can save you some money on taxes potentially, depending on your individual circumstances. So again, it's just not as straightforward as it seems. Um,
For most
so we're just gonna have to,
doctors, if you
yeah.
own a quote unquote doctor house, there's a good chance your mortgage interest alone, especially in those early years, is exceeding your standard deduction. So you're probably itemizing. And if you live in a state with state income taxes, which most states have, there's a really good chance at your income level as an attending, you're itemizing your deductions because, you're, well, with the recent SALT cap, you're limited to deducting only 10,000 from your state and local taxes, but 10,000 out of the gates plus your mortgage interest, some other things there. Like there's a good chance you're itemizing if you own that home in a state with state income tax, but not always. And then depending on your income, like what's your tax rate? It can vary. Are you in
Mm-hmm.
the 24% bracket, the 32% bracket, the 37% bracket? So that tax savings could be greater depending on what tax bracket you're in.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then the other thing that we want to take into consideration is that obviously there are other things you can potentially do with that extra money. So one question you should probably ask yourself is if I'm not putting this 567,000 or $567 a month to my mortgage, am I more likely to just spend it? Am I more likely to invest it? Like if you're just going to spend it when you have extra money, probably put it towards your mortgage. Like if that's the best way to be productive with your money. But if you can be disciplined and be like, okay, like I just want to make the best use of my money, no matter what it is, like, and I'm going to invest this money, like, let's use that as an example. So if we take that same $500,000 mortgage at 6.5% as an example, instead of paying an extra $567 a month towards the mortgage, so it's gone 10 years faster, let's say we invest it over the next few years. So if we invested over that same 30-year time period and you get a 7% rate of return, after 30 years, you'll have like almost $700,000 in the investment account. So instead of like putting money towards the mortgage and saving on interest, we're putting money into an investment account and having investment growth over that time period. And math isn't perfect, so we're using that 30-year example when in reality, if you pay off your mortgage in 20 years, you could also turn around and invest that extra mortgage payment every month. So at that point in time, like let's say you pay off your mortgage in 20 years, that's the choice you've made. Now we turn around and we invest that extra money that we're not putting into our mortgage for the next 10 years. And if you did that, then maybe you'd have around like $645,000 or so in an investment account. So in either scenario, that one's about $50,000 less than you'd have if you had spread out your mortgage over 30 years. But over 30 years, that's almost a toss up. Like in both scenarios, you own a home outright over 30 years and you have around $650 to $700,000 in an investment account after 30 years in both of those scenarios. So this just shows us that if the rate of return on your investments is pretty close to what your mortgage interest rate is, there's not really a clear cut answer. It could go either way. The other thing is that any growth in that investment account will be taxable too. So maybe we have some tax savings on the mortgage side. If we like stretch that out longer, maybe we have some taxes that we pay on the investment account. So again, it's like such a toss up when we have higher interest rates that we're dealing with.
Yeah, and some of it's emotional and
Yeah.
how do we feel about debt versus investing? Are we comfortable taking on some risk? Um, but nothing happens in a vacuum either. If we had predictable returns, predictable cash flows, had a crystal ball that could tell us, what our life was going to look like. I mean,
What
are we going
investment
to
returns are going to look like.
Yeah, exactly. What are our investment returns going to be? They're not linear. I mean, we threw out that 7% number because it's a historically reasonable, maybe some would argue possibly on the conservative side, some would argue on the optimistic side, but historically a reasonable long-term return assumption to plug in for these projections, but it's not linear. Like investments don't go up on an escalator. They're a roller coaster ride. This year we're in end of October 2024 when we're recording this, stocks are having one of their best years ever. Like, we're talking close to 30% growth over the last year. Now, there's still some time left in the year. Things could change between now and December 31st, but we've had a pretty good run for the last couple years since fall of 2022.
2022.
2022 was brutal. Most of you were probably down 20% in your investment accounts. So, all right, we've had over the last 3 years, negative 20, positive 20, positive 30 almost. Like nowhere near 7, but if you take the average of those 3 years, it's somewhere probably in the high single digits. If you
Mm-hmm.
if you didn't have any contributions or withdrawals to weigh into the equation. So we're getting a little too number heavy here. But back to life doesn't happen in a vacuum. Are you even going to be in this home in a few years, let alone 20 or 30 years? Like most people don't stay in the same home forever. If it's a starter home, sure, paying extra might help you build up equity, but a lot of that extra is, a lot of your payments in the early years are going to interest. So you might be better off if you're hoping to buy, the long-term home in a few years. Maybe we're better off putting that extra money in a savings account to earmark for a down payment in conjunction with the equity that we have in our existing home. Um, you're restarting that mortgage, call it every decade anyways. So like maybe paying extra doesn't actually make sense for that circumstance.
Yeah.
Um,
The
is
math just doesn't math. Like you see those sheets that the mortgage broker gives you. Like if you pay it off over 20 years, this is how much you save in interest. If you sell it in 5 years, none of that matters. Like it just doesn't calculate out the same way. So it's just doesn't make as much sense in those kinds of scenarios.
for sure. And then are we going to be at this interest rate forever? If you locked in a seven and a
Mm-hmm.
half percent interest rate last year when you bought your home and interest rates have come down a little since then, there's a decent chance they'll come down more in the coming year or two. No guarantees. No one can predict interest rates, but all signs are pointing towards they're probably gonna come down. How much they come down, I don't know. So there's a decent chance you could refinance to a lower interest rate in a few years. So it's kind of, some could argue wasted money to pay extra towards that interest now if it's only temporary and you could be doing some other things with that money that are important in your financial well-being.
Yeah.
Maybe we want to try and save for our kids to go to college. Well, if we're trying to pay off the mortgage over the next 20 years because it's a higher interest rate, well, we've missed the boat on college savings at that point. So, some of it has to do with the timing of your financial objectives and when those deadlines are for achieving those objectives.
Yeah. We want to do like one more example. I'm going to try to abbreviate the math because I know that's hard to follow when you're listening. But let's say, we had the same $500,000 mortgage and you had like a 5% interest rate. If you try to pay it off over 20 years instead of 30 years, you actually have to pay more extra. because the interest rate is lower. So like it's just not having as big of an impact, your extra dollars, because there's not as much interest. So you'd have to pay like $615 per month extra instead of like 570. And the interest paid goes from $466,000 over 30 years to $291,000 over 20 years. So we're paying, more than $7,000 extra per year for about $174,000 in savings. Whereas with the 6.5% interest rate, it's like, $6,800 per year extra with $240,000 of savings. So those returns are just kind of diminishing as that interest rate goes down. Obviously, like paying extra is always going to save you some on interest, but when the interest rate's lower, it's not going to have as big of an impact. And then, the investment returns are going to be similar if we assume that same 7% fairly conservative long-term rate of return. But if we invest that like extra money, that's $7,388 per year, like that's going to return more at the same rate of return. So maybe that adds up to $571,000 in an investment account because it's more money. So it's adding up to more. So the argument for paying extra towards your loans kind of goes down as the interest rate goes down. And we're hoping investment returns would be similar no matter what an interest rate on a mortgage would be.
Yeah. The lower the interest rate on the mortgage, the stronger the argument is for just paying the minimum and investing the
Yeah.
difference. The higher the interest rate on the mortgage is, the stronger the argument is in favor of paying down that mortgage. But this is, again, talking in a vacuum if our only two options in life are pay down debt versus invest.
Yep.
Again, we mentioned, are we on track for retirement savings? What about college? Is that a priority? Where are we at? How long do we plan on being in this home? Are we close to retirement? And like we have enough, we're financially independent. We could, in theory, retire tomorrow if we wanted to. Well, then it's not as big of a decision. It's more of an emotional one. Like, how badly do we want to not have a mortgage in retirement versus having a mortgage for the first 5 to 10 years of retirement?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's not super clear cut, but I think when it comes to financial planning, we want to take everything into the equation and look at what are our overall objectives. Are we on track to reaching these objectives in a reasonable time frame? And if not, what areas potentially could use some more attention? So,
Yeah.
if we have limited cash flow, we have to decide what to do with that money. Opportunity cost is, if we spend $1 over here, that's $1 that can't be spent over there. So we got to kind of pick and choose what we're gonna do here.
Yeah.
And
I think one thing people consider when they're thinking about this is just like, how comfortable are they with investing? Like, I think there is something to be said for risk tolerance. So when we're talking about debt repayment, that has the advantage of being measurable and predictable. Like we know, like if we do this, this is what we get out of it, period. We get to pay less interest. And so it's really the less risky option because you know exactly what you're getting out of it. With investing, that can often give you higher returns, especially if your mortgage interest rate is lower, but there's no guarantee from year to year. It varies a lot. And some people are like fairly comfortable with that, others aren't so much. So, like, how comfortable you are with those things can affect what you decide. And I think a lot of times when we see clients that are really debt averse and are really determined to pay off whatever their debt is faster, those are often people that are also risk averse. Like they're just not super comfortable with investing. I think those two things often go hand in hand.
for
So it
sure.
makes sense that you're making those decisions. And like we always try to advise our clients, like, here's the thing that like makes the most sense from a numbers standpoint, but it's absolutely okay for you to consider like your personal comfort level as well when you're making these decisions.
And to keep, if we're looking at debt simplistically from a numbers standpoint, the interest rate on your debt is equivalent to the guaranteed rate of return you'd be getting on an investment because you're avoiding that interest expense by paying it off. So if you have a 6.5% rate mortgage, that's a guaranteed 6.5% rate of return on your money. There's not really any investment out there that can give you a guaranteed 6.5% rate of return with no risk. So again, depending on your comfort level with risk, like you might say, oh, 6.5, I can probably do better in an investment account. I'd rather invest my money, be more aggressive, put it all in stocks and, odds are I'll do better over the long run. Great, not guaranteed, but that's, one mindset to approach. Other people are like, yeah, 6.5% guaranteed, sign me up. Like, let's do it. Um, so yeah, some of it, again, that higher the interest rate is, the stronger the case is for paying down a debt. But you could look at all your debts together too. So if we have a credit card with a balance on it at 19%, well, let's pay off that guaranteed 19% interest rate. Um, that's a better rate of return than a 6.5% mortgage that's tax deductible. So,
Absolutely.
assuming your mortgage is your highest interest rate debt, and we're ignoring student loans for now, if we're eligible for public service loan forgiveness, then, regardless of the interest rate, it doesn't really make sense to pay extra because we're going to get them forgiven after 10 years of payments. But those are a little bit of an anomaly. Um, so there's the math side of it, there's the comfort with risk side of it, there's the what do you think you can get, but we also want to look at our objectives, like whether you want it to be or not. If you just pay the minimum due every month on your mortgage, it will be paid off in 30 years. Guaranteed. There's few
If you
things.
have the house for 30 years
If yeah, assuming you're in the
and you
house.
don't refinance and extend it out for another 30 years from the date of your refinance.
For sure. Assuming no refinance, assuming you don't sell, assuming no extra payments, if you just pay the minimum every month, the mortgage will be zero after 360 monthly payments. But your retirement portfolio isn't guaranteed to be sufficient after 30 years if you're not saving enough. So, even if the comfort level with risk, everything, is tilted one way or the other, it might make sense to say, hey, we know this is on track to be done in a reasonable time frame. Our retirement currently isn't on track. So that could use some extra love and attention. So let's maybe bolster that up a little bit before we start considering throwing extra at this mortgage, because I don't know if you want to still be working in 30 years. So let's take that into consideration.
And that is worth asking yourself too. Like, when do I want to retire? What's my time frame look like? If I am planning to retire early, okay, we probably should put more money into retirement savings. I think we often use a benchmark of just like try to save 20% of your gross income for retirement as a way to like get there at a reasonable age and not reduce your lifestyle. But it also depends on your age, depends on when you want to retire, all of those kinds of things as well. So, try to make sure you're paying attention to all of those goals as well.
We're
Um,
using linear assumptions with all of this.
yeah.
Like, there's a good chance your income is going to change over time. So, as you get
Mhm.
pay raises, as kids get out of daycare expenses, maybe get out of the house altogether, like, we should have some extra money potentially at that point that you could pay extra on the mortgage or pay more towards retirement. What about bonuses too?
Yeah.
Like, maybe you switch jobs, get a sign on bonus. Maybe you just get annual RVU bonuses. Like, we can always throw lump sums at these various objectives as well. It doesn't have to be a monthly figure. So that's where it's not super straightforward and simple. And that's why
Yeah.
Rachelle and I have jobs. If it was easy, like,
Absolutely.
we wouldn't be employed.
Yeah. A lot of times when we have people who are getting closer to retirement age and they feel like they're on a really good track for retirement and like having enough resources to retire, that's when we can be like, okay, like maybe we want to knock out this mortgage for retire before retirement. Maybe we have 10 years left. Let's kind of like have a goal, like even though we have 15 years left on our mortgage, to have it gone in 10 years so that we just have less of a demand on our retirement resources when we get there, which can be a really good way to approach it if you feel like you are on track for retirement. Yeah. And that
Mhm.
that gives you that's another like kind of risk management piece too. So if we have lower costs, that gives us a lot more stability in retirement. So we don't have to pull from our investment account assets quite as much. And if there is some volatility in the market and things like that, we can let our money sit if we don't need as much money on a year to year basis. So that can be really helpful to kind of manage cash flows in retirement if we have lower housing costs.
There's also the possibility of, having like a home equity line of credit on that home with a paid off mortgage, and could tap into that for major expenses here and there, or, you get more flexibility when you don't have that debt attached to it. So a lot of components to weigh in. So it really is case by case basis.
Absolutely. Fun, fun. I think there are lots of ways to go about this. So it's like, okay, what's the answer to this question? Should I pay off my mortgage faster or not? It always depends. That's always the answer. If you need a you need a shortcut answer to what do Rochelle and Corey always say, it depends. That's the answer.
Yep.
So just consider what your other financial objectives are. Consider if you're on track for retirement savings. What about college savings? What's the interest rate on your house? Are you even going to be in this house in 3, 4, 5 years? Do you think that you can potentially refinance to a lower rate in a year or two? What's your comfort level with investing versus debt management? Like, where are you at? And if you're close to retirement and you have enough saved up and you want to be debt free in retirement, maybe paying it off extra at that point if we're like on track. And then you can just let your investments grow more in retirement, which is a great solution and something to think about, especially if you're getting closer to retirement age.
To play the other side of the coin, if you have a
Yeah.
relatively low interest rate loan, potentially could just invest the extra money and pay off your mortgage in a lump sum the day you retire. And
Mm-hmm.
then you potentially have more money in the investment account. So we can make arguments either direction in all of these scenarios, which doesn't help you guys at all. I mean, you just want us to tell you what to do. But it is, we want to, we don't want to be narrow-minded, short-sighted with it. We want to try and weigh in the different things, pros and cons, opportunity costs, what else could we be doing with this money that could be more beneficial for us and our individual financial objectives? Like, how important are these other things to us versus how important is it to not have a mortgage in our life? Um, so we definitely don't want to make those knee-jerk decisions, look at that mortgage payoff sheet and say, oh my gosh, that's a lot of interest. I better pay extra to avoid this. It might make sense.
Absolutely.
It very well could be the right decision for you. But we want to just pause, slow down a little bit and see what else potentially makes more sense. And if paying off the mortgage seems to be the optimal choice in your life, then let's do it. We're all for it.
Yeah.
I've never met anyone who regretted paying off their mortgage. So there's plenty of things you can regret in life when it comes to finances. Oh, I should have invested in this, not that. Should have saved more for retirement. Shouldn't have bought that big of a house. But I've never met anyone who said, yeah, I really wish I didn't pay off my mortgage faster. I wish I just spread that thing out. I've met people who are very happy. They spread their mortgage out and said, yeah, I'm glad I saved more for retirement instead of paying this mortgage off because now I can retire. Um, but no one's ever said, man, I wish I didn't pay off my mortgage.
I
Yet to
think
meet
for the
that
folks
person.
that do that, they are pretty determined to do it. And when you have that kind of conviction, like it's unlikely that you're going to have regrets. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. If nothing else, paying off the mortgage is still a productive thing to do financially. Like there's worse things you could do. Fly to Vegas, throw the money all on your favorite sports team. Um, but yeah, it's still a productive move, even if it's not the most optimal one.
absolutely. Well, thank you for listening, everyone. If you have any questions, you know where to find us. Talk to you next time.
See you later.